Leap of Fate podcast fans. Welcome back to this week's episode with yours truly, as always, Randy Silver. This week's episode is all going to be around language. I have a friend of mine, Valerie Fridland, on. Valerie, say hi to the fans.
Hi, guys and girls.
And girls.
And everybody.
All of it.
Language is important.
Yeah, language is important, as we'll find out. She's a professor of linguistics at the Department of English in University of Nevada Reno, which is in Reno, California, of course. Excuse me, Reno, California. Reno, Nevada, not Reno, California. It's been a long day on my side. Let me tell you a little bit about her and why she's on and how she's going to help us with the Leap of Faith message, which, of course, is around overcoming adversity, teaching life lessons, helping you be the best version of yourself. So Valerie is a professor, as I said, and a former director of graduate studies in the Department of English at the University of Nevada in Reno. Again, Reno, Nevada. She's an expert on the relationship between language and society. Her work has appeared in numerous academic journals, and she is the co-author of the book, Social Phonetics. Valerie also speaks and writes widely for popular audience. Her language blog, Language in the Wild, appears in Psychology Today, and her general audience lecture series, Language and Society, is featured with the Great Courses. She's appeared on many different media outlets, including CBS News, NPR, The Newsy, The Y, and regular appearances on podcast radio shows such as Elegant Warrior, Mentor Project, and The Torch. So you can see she is very educated, being a professor, always with it. And she's here today to help us talk about linguistics, and how it plays a role in our daily lives and how we communicate with each other, the way you say different words, the way that you say different letters, the way that people's different dialects come across in different cultures, different areas of the world, even different parts of the state sound different, how it all can matter to make sure what you're trying to say and the message you want to come across comes across the right way, and how people may interpret what you're saying differently based on where they're at. So with that being said, I'm going to bring Valerie back into the conversation. Valerie, welcome to the Leap of Faith podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today.
Well, happy to have you. Is there anything in the intro I missed that you think is important for the audience to know?
Well, I'm very excited to be in California for the day and Nevada. So I like being a bi-state participant. Yeah. I think that's a great introduction. I really just look at language and how it ties into our social life. So I think any of that is in the sphere of what I do.
Yeah. So would you like to tell people kind of what your day-to-day is? Because it's a little bit different than what actually I want to speak about. So I want people understanding what your focus is on the day-to-day through your professoring and for your research that you're doing for yourself.
Right. Well, I'm what's called a social linguist, which means if in big sort of breakdown, I look at language and social life. But the way that I look at language and social life is probably not the way that the everyday speaker thinks about how language fits with social life. We all have these opinions, right? And we think about, oh my God, her voice is so angry, or she's so cranky, or I hate the sound of that vocal fry in her voice. So we have these ideas about language socially, and that's a lot of times what people think I study. And we do look at those things. So I do study vocal fry in various aspects of your voice. But linguists like me often take a very small level feature, like the way that you say a vowel sound. That's my specialty. And we look at how that really indexes who you are socially. So people have been shown to be able to tell things about you, like your ethnicity, your gender, your age, from just hearing you say hello. So those are pretty powerful devices then we have, both in terms of speaking and in terms of perceiving. The problem, of course, is that we can often have these really strong, inculcated prescriptivist ideas about what is a good voice or a good vowel or a good sound or a good word and what's a bad one. And that's where it really starts to be dangerous in terms of how we relate to each other and how the types of opportunities we give other people. But my day-to-day is doing research. So I'll ask people to either talk to me and I'll record their speech, and then I'll do an analysis with the computer on, for example, where their vowels are, so I can study sort of how they position their mouth to make those vowel sounds. And we find that people doing different things for both social and linguistic reasons will position their mouth differently for different vowel sounds depending on those factors.
Interesting.
And I can tell that by the frequencies that they create in the acoustic waveform. So
So
we kind of backtrack that.
can I give you the audio recording of this podcast and that analyze how I talk? It's not good right now.
Well, unfortunately, it's a little more tricky
Yeah.
than just that, because you have to do things like transcribe it and force align it, which is surprisingly labor intensive. But yes, it would be possible. It would be possible to do that. So I do things like that. I actually study those things empirically, and then I write papers about what that means. I also do some historic work. So I look back and I find recordings from, people born in the middle to late 1800s that were recorded in the early 1900s. And I analyze their speech and compare it to how speech is today to see what has changed over time. So that's the type of thing I do day to day.
What are some of the evolutions you've seen of how speech has over time gone from 1800s, 1900s to today?
Well, it's first of all been the kinds of influences we have on our speech, so we've had different levels of mixture in terms of the original dialects that were formed in the Americas with the colonies. Plus you had indigenous languages that they displaced. So there have been a lot of seismic changes like that, where, some languages have been displaced by the incoming colonizing language. So that's a huge change. But then you also have settlement dialects that develop. So you have colonial dialects, which are when people bring a dialect or a language over to a place that they're in sort of taking over and have the political power for. But then as those people spread, like they did in the United States, the colonies along the East Coast spread west, they then get these mixtures that become settler dialects. So they take these originating dialects that were quite varied along the East Coast. So you have sort of the settlements in the New England area colonies and Massachusetts versus the one closer to Jamestown, and very different types of people settled in the intervening colonies in between these two. So people from different types of dialects. You had the Scotch Irish, right? You had Northern British, you had Southern British. And then you also had, of course, the Dutch that were in the New York area. And then you had a lot of African influence in the South. So all of these things came together to make some pretty substantive differences that were then brought westward, where there were more mixing of the original settler dialects. So you got sort of a more homogeneous kind of variety. So a lot of the very noticeable features of, for example, a late 1800s New England dialect, which would have been things like R-lessness and the vowel in ask as ask or glass, those things sort of end up getting leveled or sort of gotten rid of as more and more dialects get mixed in the West Coast. So it's not that people from New England didn't settle in the West. In fact, a lot of them did, but then so did a lot of British settlers, so did a lot of Chinese settlers, so did a lot of Southern settlers, so did a lot of Midland settlers. All of them swamped certain areas so that you had this great vast diversity of early dialects. And then those really distinctive features kind of got leveled out or pushed away. So the biggest changes over the last 100 years have been first the sort of changes to dialects as more and more speakers came into contact and leveled to sort of a variety that was sort of a mixture of some of the prominent dialect features, but probably didn't carry over some of the very noticeable features of other regions. But also in the last 50 years, those dialects have shifted radically in terms of the vowel sounds that we make. So if you look at the vowels in the North, the South, and the West, they are strikingly different from the vowels that we hear in even shows from like the 1920s and 30s. So if you go back and listen to old newscasts, for example, or newsreels from the 1920s and 30s, you'll hear a vastly different kind of speech that was valued than what we say today. First of all, it's a lot more casual today. There was sort of a mismatch between American and British in the early 1900s because we still sort of had this love affair with all things British.
Yep.
Because America was very young and our language was considered less prominent and prestigious. So British dialect features were really held in high esteem. But especially as we became more prominent in power and the British sort of empire faded, Americanisms became more popular. So one thing that has changed vastly between the early 1900s and the 2000s is the amount of Americanisms that we have in our speech, for one, but also we say things very differently. So for example, the word COT and the word CAUGHT, can you say those two separately for me? So COT.
Caught.
And then CAUGHT.
Caught.
All right. Do you notice you say them the same?
Yes.
Well, historically, they're not.
Oh.
So that's sort of very typical of a Western dialect speaker, where they have lost that vowel distinction that some other dialects had and that were brought over to the New World.
So for like an example, would be like tomato or tomato, or potato and potato.
Yeah, well, actually, tomato is a really interesting history. And the reason we have these two varying pronunciations of those words is the timing of the borrowing of that word. So when it was a European word, the A sound, because that's actually a Mexican word, Mexican Spanish word, or a Mexican, I think it's Nahuatl is the name of the dialect that it comes from, tomata. And it was brought over by European explorers back to Spain. It was then Europeanized, essentially, in its pronunciation towards tomato. But it was also imported into the United States and based on around the same time, around 1500, which was, of course, in some of the early settlement areas, just starting to get established in the United States, in the Americas. It was borrowed also in analogy with potato, how that was pronounced. So if you were in America saying the word, it was said based on analogy with potato. And that's why you said tomato. But if you were in Europe with that word, you said it based on tomato, which was the European pronunciation of the vowel sound of things written with an A, basically. And so we have these two pronunciations, tomato, tomato, because of the fact that you would say it one way in Europe and one way in America.
No, I've always wondered why people say potato, potato. It's like some type of saying you always hear. So like, there's the history of it.
That's random, right? The potato, potato is just a joke on the fact that potato was the original word that tomato got modeled on in America.
But so as a follow-up to you, a more serious question, because you talked about how language moved from, Europe, Africa, into the East Coast and the West Coast. So then what is the reason why people say from like New York have a little bit harsher accent, the way they say stuff, versus people in California where it's a little bit more chill? It's because of the way languages form together, or is there other reasons that stopped us sounding all the same across the US?
Well, first of all, I think there's two different really, really interesting things in that question. One is, why do languages change over time, right? Why do we sound different? Another is, why do we have these different feelings about the way that people sound? So you sort of described the New Yorker speech as kind of harsh and California speech is kind of chill. And so what's really interesting is there's two different things going on. And I think both of them are really important and interesting. The first is language naturally evolves over time. How many of the listeners have ever been forced to read Beowulf, right, in high school?
High school. Yep. I remember that book.
Everybody has been forced. Did you understand it? Not a bit, actually. Truthfully, hardly any of us understand much. Maybe a few words here and there, but generally Old English is a foreign language, because it is the natural evolution of language to change over time. And if that was not true, we would be speaking Old English today. We speak something radically different. In fact, the word stock of Old English was 80% Germanic, if not more than that. The word stock of modern English is, I think, 30% Germanic. It's something really small, maybe even less than that, because we've had so many different cultural, social, and even ideological shifts in that 1,000 years from the time of Old English. And those things mix with the inherent tendency of language to change based on cognitive and articulatory pressures. So there are certain ways our mouths were built. There are certain ways our brains process. And so those things impact the way that languages change over time. So certain types of changes are not possible, and other types of changes are very possible. And what we find is that language changes in ways that make sense from a cognitive and articulatory standpoint. A great example of this is how we delete consonants on the ends of words. So you can see, in California in particular, actually, people say the word what, a very sort of typical young Californian pronunciation that would be like, what?
I got what?
Right. And so you've deleted the T, right, in sort of the idealized version of that word. So instead of what, you say what. That's called consonant deletion, right? You're deleting a consonant off the end of a word. Well, we do that in all sorts of contexts, but it stands out in certain contexts and not others because of the nature of the speakers that are doing it. If everybody deleted that T, no one would notice it. But because it's sort of become a sort of shibboleth of Southern Californianism, especially young female Southern Californianism, it has this, stereotype associated with it of like, what type thing, right? So it's developed that stereotype because that one type of speaker has been more recognizable in doing that. But the reality is all of us delete consonants on the ends of words. It's because of our articulatory difficulty in pronouncing consonant clusters at the ends of words. So a lot of us do this process where we just delete a consonant. A good example would be a word like whisks, right?
Whisk.
Word whisk, like to whisk something. That's a hard word, whisk. That's just a weird word, right? So a lot of us would say, I whisk it.
Yeah.
Right? Where you just delete that consonant. And I guarantee you, all of us do that in normal everyday speech. So the same process from an articulatory standpoint, because we all delete consonants because it makes more sense from our articulatory standpoint in terms of syllable structure. We have preferences for the types of syllables we like. But when one group does it more or one group does it less, and we start to regularly recognize a pattern with those groups, then those things start to take on meaning. Like, oh, that's an uneducated pronunciation, or that's a cool hip pronunciation, or that's sort of an ethnic group pronunciation. And that's when we start to assign social meaning to something that has nothing to do with socialness and everything to do with articulatory structure. And that's how language changes over time, because we either move away from those things or we move towards them, and we do them in different ways. So where you're deleting your consonants, I might not be deleting mine, but I'll delete them somewhere else, and you may or may not notice that depending on how salient it is.
Got it.
Right. So that's the first question is that you asked, is how did they change? Well, they just change from social distance, from geographic distance, and from cognitive and articulatory pressures. Of course, thrown in there things like war, conflict, and ideology, right? That makes us change things. And that's why, for example, we see shifts in pronouns. Those things, shifts in pronouns, have happened for 500 years. There have been debates about what pronouns we should use for our third persons. In the 16 and 1700s, those debates were whether you should say generic he or she, right? So in fact, it was legislated in the 1700s that it should be generic he, because of the worthiness doctrine, which was that the male of the species is superior to the female. And so things relating to men should be superior to things relating to women. And that was known as the worthiness doctrine. And that was taken from Latin, where masculine was the grammatical masculine was considered the primary and sort of first thing you would go to. So we've sort of built our beliefs about language on those kinds of ideologies. Well, with pronouns, what's changed is a seismic cultural shift, but in an area of language that has inherently been problematic. So our third person pronouns, if you have a third person pronoun that's unknown, so you're talking about somebody, right? So somebody needs to do this. Well, we don't know if somebody's he, she, or non-binary, right? They can be anything. So historically, we've basically decided the other people don't matter, just the he's matter. So we're going to say if somebody needs to do this, he should do X, right? But the problem is that's a violation. That's a violation because you're potentially violating gender norms, right? So it might be a she, or it might be someone that's non-binary. It doesn't have to be he, but by choosing he, you are automatically having a sort of conflict between a generic gender pronoun or word and a gendered pronoun. So that's a conflict of grammar.
Can I jump in really quick?
Sure. Sorry.
No, you're good. The example that came in my head when you said that is like you guys. Like it could be a group of girls or a group of guys and girls. 90% of the time, people say you guys. It's never like you girls go do that. And it's like I catch myself all the time trying to fix that because that's not accurate. It's exactly what you're saying.
Right. Right. And that's exactly what I did at the beginning. I caught myself because it leaves out half of a population or more. And when you think about just grammatical rules, though, if you're only using a male pronoun to refer to people that may or may not be male, then you're actually violating a rule of gender agreement. But if you use they, the argument is you're violating a rule of plural agreement, right? Because you have a singular subject with a plural. So you violate a rule in either case. And the only thing that determines which rule is okay to be violated is cultural beliefs. And so seismic cultural change, like the movement towards being empathetic with non-binarity and with gender norms and gender equality, those things have caused language change. So there are lots of different things that can cause a change of a language to evolve. And if language didn't evolve, then we're in trouble because that means we're speaking Latin, which obviously we know how that ended up with those speakers, right?
Yeah. So let me put you on the spot with this question. This is more about the evolution of words being said than actual, say, syllables in language. How has the way language evolved changed with the event of technology? And so let me bring that out for a little bit. Back in the day, say up to like 1900s, you had to like go to a play or go somewhere, a big town hall, and you heard people speak. You're like, oh, I've heard them never speak like that before. I'll use that. Fast forward today with podcasts, radios, television, YouTube, internet, you can hear someone say something and then instantly that could take over the world. And my example is the term no cap. If I say no cap, do you know what that means?
Yeah, I know that word, cap, no cap.
Yeah. So, but like that just came out of nowhere for like overnight because rappers started saying it and then it just like took over society. And if you don't know what no cap means, it means cap means lie. So no cap means no lie. So it's just a slang term. So how do you feel like, or what have you seen in your research and learnings, how technology, now that people can hear languages around the world instantaneously versus you had to go travel or hear someone come to your town, which maybe never happened? How does that evolutionize how languages change over time in our today's age?
Well, that's a really good question and actually an interesting one. And it's something that has not been researched for that many years because it's a relatively new phenomenon, right? That we have this kind of social media activity or even availability. But what you're talking about is vocabulary words, and those are actually very easy to transmit across time and space. So even before the internet, right? If I heard someone say a word and I thought, oh, they're kind of cool saying that word, I'm going to bring it home and say it. I could spread language that way. So words might become popularized because you hear, somebody in Montana say it and you bring it back to California because it's so cool to say. But you're right. You didn't have the ability to do that to the same degree. You didn't have the dissemination, right? Now we really have great dissemination over social media. What's interesting, I think, about language and what has been studied is the type of language that gets disseminated tends to be language from marginalized groups that then have their language appropriated. And so that has actually fueled a lot of debate because, for example, cap, no cap is an African-American English rap, right? It came from rap. It's African-American English in origin. And so when white speakers start using historically African-American forms without the recognition of where they started, then that can cause those whose language it originally was to feel like they're in getting cultural appropriation because the words are being borrowed without the history behind what started them. Now, I don't know that much about the history between cap, no cap, but I know there are a variety of other words, like the word woke, for example, one that in the early 1900s was used in African-American communities to be safe. right? If you're woke to what was going on, that means you need to be aware of your surroundings, be aware of that you're safe, because you could get lynched, right? You could get killed, you could get arrested because of the color of your skin. And so some people have found that that appropriation of woke to mean socially aware, and now it's sort of degradation to mean a negative perspective of socially aware,
Yeah.
to be something that's really not appropriate, because it sort of lets go of the original use of that word as being careful because your safety was at risk, to now just sort of being a word that means socially aware to a fault, right?
Mm-hmm.
Normally not an African-American person, but a white person in the new form of that word. So there are good sides and bad sides to this in vast amount of sort of dissemination that we can do with language. That said, I know that's been a debate in linguistics about how do you make sure that when words are borrowed, that you're not losing the history of those words, right? Because that's where danger has been historically. So, with the changing, for example, of the Washington Redskins name,
Yep.
that is because, well, people, lose sight when they use a word over and over again in a modern context, like, okay, the name of a football team that they love, or squaw is another good example. They lose sight of the history of why that term might be offensive to some. So, for example, with squaw, it actually was used often to refer to Native American women as prostitutes. So when you say you're going to go ski at squaw, you're basically saying, I'm going to go ski at that indigenous woman who's a prostitute, right?
Mm-hmm.
It brings up things for people that we ignore. So that is the danger with such rapid dissemination, is that you get words and the history is lost because they're spread so rapidly all around the world that we no longer remember why we said them in the first place. So that's a lot of the scholarship that's been done on that kind of fast viral aspect to language dissemination. The flip side, though, is that it is a great way to transmit and sort of become more similar in some ways in the way that we think about the world and we perceive things, because language is about perception, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we encode our experience in the world in language, right? We talk about things in the way that we've been trained to talk about it, and it belies a certain view of the world when we describe things a certain way. So, for example, if I describe something as blue, in English, American English, it's blue whether it's light blue or dark blue. But if I'm Russian and I'm describing something, a light blue and a dark blue are two separate colors. So cognitive, it's going to be like an American English speaker saying, well, that's brown and that's blue, right? Which we see the world differently because of the way language encodes things. But if we share more language by social media throughout the world, maybe we start to understand each other's perspectives a little more. And I think that's why it's been considered important to make sure the history of a word, the origin of a word, is transmitted with the word. So it's not just, teenagers thinking cap is cool, but teenagers thinking, look, African American English is really cool and ingenious and innovative, and this signifies a lifestyle or a life experience that African Americans had. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So can you see how that's sort of a little different type of borrowing of a word than the appropriation that often happens otherwise?
And I think the squaw is a really good example as well, because we're videotaping this end of April, and ski season's kind of over, but so many people I heard was like, why Squaw Valley changed their name? Why is Squaw doing this? Why are they doing that? And they don't understand the origin of the word. They just know it for a ski resort, or like it may be an Indian name, but you can't even say Indian, because the Cleveland Indians had to change their name as well. So it feels like a lot of history in our words today are really
Loaded.
they're bloated. The meaning of the word is gone, so you don't really understand what you're saying and how you could say it to the wrong person and just bypass the Squaw Valley, and that could have really hurt them because their family could have been that squaw back in the day.
Right. And I think that's what we forget, right? We get distant from those meanings, or we don't have them at all, right? Some of us, we might only have experienced the word squaw in the name of a mountain or the name of a ski resort. But when you think about, well, what if it was your grandmother that was called that? Would you want something named, Whore, right? You wouldn't want to go skiing on Whore Mountain. Right?
No.
Because that means something to us. We understand that meaning. And so what we want to do is make sure we're not denying the right to feel that way to other people by the way that we use labels. And so that's really what's the movement there. I think people misconstrue it as being political correctness, when really, if you actually know the history of some of these words, you realize, God, I can't believe I was saying that. That's pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
Right.
So as a follow-up to that, then if I'm just a high schooler and I hear my friends say cap, no cap, or any word, slang word, oh, that's so cool, and use it, how do we educate them what the real meaning is if we as a society potentially don't know that? Does it come from the school system? Does it come from us having to educate each other, from people doing social economic work to make it happen? How do we educate at that point?
Well, I think that's also one of the benefits of social media, right? Because a lot of times in social media, things do get contextualized. So you're talking to people you would not already talk to. So, our social networks in real life tend to be pretty, or non-virtually tend to be pretty narrow, and they follow this idea of homophily, which means that we talk to people that look like us and talk like us and are like us more than we talk to people that don't. And so in the neighborhoods we live in and the workplaces we inhabit, and often the schools we go to, we might be with people that are more like us. But on social media, we actually might have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people that we converse with on a daily basis. And so their histories and their knowledge are things we have access to in a way that we never had them before. So a lot of times I think in social media, these things get brought up outside of very small communities. But people, for example, you specified that no cap came from rap, right? It came from this background where a lot of people would realize, okay, it's African American in origin. And I think a lot of times that actually gets highlighted on Twitter or on Instagram or wherever people are, that those things actually do get brought up, maybe more than people in the days before social media that didn't have access to such a broad network to bring those things up. So I think that's somewhat the value of technology and this connectedness that we haven't had before. So I think there are a couple of different ways. I think linguistics should be taught in schools. There are so many fascinating aspects of linguistics. It's pretty terrifying to think we don't teach children about the structure of the language that they use. We teach children about the structure of other languages that they're learning, but we think that grammar that we teach in schools is the same thing or equivalent to linguistics, when it's not, right? There are a lot of different aspects of linguistics that go into how we speak. So if people understand the norms of language from a cognitive and articulatory standpoint, that will help them be teachers. It will help them be speech pathologists. It'll help them be more empathetic humans. For example, when people come over speaking non-native dialects, of why it's so hard to pronounce certain words, because those sounds don't exist in their language. That's the type of thing that you will learn in linguistics. Certain sounds are English sounds, other sounds might be, French sounds, and it's very hard to learn French because we don't have identical sound systems. But we don't learn that kind of thing in school. And if we did, it would really help us, I think, be more empathetic. But also you could learn lexicography, which would be a really exciting way to introduce kids to the histories of the words that they say. And that's where we go and we find, going back 500-600 years, where these words came from, who said them, and how did they change? And a lot of times it's fascinating stories behind why we say the words we do. So for example, the word dude, which is omnipresent, especially in California English, has a fascinating history. And it actually, in the 1800s, meant completely the opposite of what it means today. So the fact that being a dude is like a cool, chill kind of guy, or now it can be a girl too, it can be anybody. That's the opposite of what it meant in the late 1800s, when it was basically calling someone a effeminate dandy. And it was considered dude worthy at the time. I mean, dual worthy, and dude worthy. But when people would get upset if you got called a dude, because it basically insulted your masculinity, substantially insulted your masculinity. So people would not have wanted to be called dudes back then. So it's really funny when you see the history of words that kids use every day. And I think they'd love to learn that kind of thing. There is actually a linguist, Mary Buckles, who has designed a program for high schools and schools to bring linguistics called skills. It's linguistic skills into the classroom. And I think that would be of great value.
That's really interesting. I had no idea dude was opposite of what dude is.
Yeah, totally different dude back then.
So then for you, as we kind of take it around third base and we go to the back half of the podcast here, for you at Reno, is this the type of stuff that you teach your students, or what are you focusing on when you're in your lecture halls?
Well, I do a bunch of different things, and I teach different classes that have different aspects. So I teach general linguistics, which teaches the structure of language. So that has really less to do with the social side of language and more to do with the cognitive and articulatory side of language, like I was talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And that's things like what is the syntax of sentences? How do we know what subjects are and what objects are? And how do we mark that? So, in Old English, we would mark it with case markings on things like adjectives and nouns that would tell us where they went. And because we did that, we wouldn't have to be so set in our ordering of where words went in sentences. But as we lost the case system, we couldn't put our subjects at the ends of words anymore because people wouldn't know they were subjects because there's nothing marking that. So we had to move the order to make it more subject, verb, object in structure. So that's the type of thing we learn in those kinds of classes. We also would learn what are the sound systems of different languages. And so why does that make languages harder or easier to say when you learn languages that have very different sound systems or not so different sound systems? And that's a general linguistics class. But I also teach a class called social linguistics. And in that class, we do things like study the history of the word dude, come to understand the evolution of the singular pronoun they, or we look at language bias and how that comes through in perception studies. So we actually study the studies that tell us about how we use language and think about it. And we do really fun experiments. So one experiment I did in my class last semester was I had them go and ask people the time. It's random strangers on campus. And when the person would give them the time, they would say, "Thank you," and see what the response was of the person that answered, right? Because
what were some of the responses people got?
A lot of people got no worries. A ton of people get no problem. Sometimes you get nothing at all, right? People just don't answer you. And very, very rarely in modern English, you get you're welcome, right? So, and what's interesting, the older the respondent, the less often they would even say anything. Like they thought my students weren't worthy of a you're welcome.
I probably would say my pleasure.
My pleasure. Okay. So, and that's a different strategy, right? So when you say my pleasure, that's a gratitude. That's a gratitude expression that's saying, sort of self-aware, saying, okay, this is my pleasure. I enjoyed it. The burden was on me, and I'm so grateful.
That's how I live my life. So that's perfect.
Right? Yeah, that's that. But then when you say something like no problem, people get upset because people think, well, that means I was a problem. Right. So my pleasure is taking the responsibility on you. No problem is putting the responsibility on someone else. And both of them are ways of just saying it wasn't a big deal. Yeah. But people kind of get upset when people don't use this form they expect. And older speakers don't like no problem more than younger speakers. So we did a little study on the changing norms of politeness and the expectations about that. We read some studies about it, and then I had them go out and do an experiment, and we would find pretty much what we found in our studies. So that's the kind of thing we would do in class. And
I would take that class.
Yeah, it's a fun class.
It's a great class. So it's funny because I do say my pleasure like all the time. When people ask for something, I'm like, no, it's my pleasure. It's no big deal. And people like, can you stop saying my pleasure? It sounds like old English. Like just say like, thank you, or like, no problem. But like, I get, it's like, it really, as you said, like makes no sense in my head. Like I'm not feeling like it's a problem to me, but like, I enjoyed helping you out. So that's why I say it's my pleasure. It's no big deal.
Well, it is. That's actually very interesting. They would say it sounds like old English because it really is based on changing norms of politeness. So the last century, we've shifted from something called discernment politeness, which was one that paid attention to rank and sort of expectations for behavior. And so generally speaking, you would say something like my pleasure because you would want them to know, yes, sir, absolutely. It'd be very kind of, I'm looking out for your rank and your feelings. But we shifted to volitional politeness, which is more about maintaining my independence and my freedom. And so no problem responds to volition, right? You're imposing on me and I'm telling you it was not a big imposition. So that's sort of a response that's in this new form of politeness where imposition is a big deal. Whereas in the past, imposition wasn't a big deal because of our rank differences and status differences. You didn't get to feel good or bad about what you did. It was expected that you would behave that way. And that's called discernment politeness. So not one is not better than the other, but they're just different. And today, if you look at, for example, Japanese culture, it's one based much more on discernment politeness. And Americans have much more volition politeness. And so a lot of times when you have intercultural interactions, you might get some feeling of not being properly polite. Especially if you're a Japanese speaker, you might think Americans are not all that polite because they're always concerned with themselves rather than with others, or that's how it gets read. That's not actually what the politeness means. It simply means what's important to us as speakers has changed. And we protect imposition rather than rank. But people misconstrue this based on their own beliefs about how people should behave.
Interesting. You've been dropping so many knowledge bombs here. I love it. This is great. This is awesome.
Well, that is what they paid me the big bucks for, right?
Yeah. So you've been so valuable with your time. I have one more question for you, and then we'll let you go enjoy the rest of your day. And this is going to be not around the syllables and everything. It's just more of like a thought question to get your perspective. The way that people say words to me matters. And you can say something and be like, oh, like, no problem. But you're like, nope, that was a problem. But like, because I said it that way, you can infer that I was annoyed. So, and I feel like today, a lot of stuff, especially people over social media, when you just read a text, they infer it the wrong way. And that's a little bit of a different conversation. That's a whole different conversation. But how can we as a society do a better job at communicating better with each other? If it's English to English, if it's English to say UK English, if it's English to Spanish, because I feel like a lot of the rhetoric we're seeing is created by people inferring something when it's not, and it started with the way this stuff is being said. So hopefully this is making sense. So my question to you is like, yes. how can we work better as a society?
Right. It's a very important question because I think, a lot of the things we've talked about before might be fun tidbits, but this is something that really impacts people and how they interact and perhaps the opportunities they give each other, and the way that they think about each other in terms of being open to conversation or not. And we have a really interesting body of research that suggests that the way you believe someone will affect the way you hear them speak. So if I see a face that might be a person of color, for example, I might infer an accent that doesn't exist because of my beliefs about people that I've met in the past, or what I believe someone that looks like that would talk like. So it's called accent hallucination. And we actually find that when you, for example, play the same speech sample for subjects, and on one screen, you might flash my face, for example, and then on another screen, you might have an Asian woman's face. And then you ask them to rate how accented the speech was. And remember, this is the same speech that they're hearing, as in both cases. They will rank the person, the speech when they saw the Asian photo as more accented and harder to understand.
That was the same person's speaking both times.
Same person's speech, right?
Interesting.
The same person's speech. So we find this over and over again. Not only that, but we also find people inferring emotional valences from the expectations they have with certain groups. So, for example, whether someone is happy or sad, you might infer from the way that they look, or what you believe about a certain type of speaker. And we had a study by Wessler, and I think it was 2021, that looked at how people perceive Black women's voices as angrier than they are actually intended, because of these stereotypical associations and beliefs we have about angry Black women. Which is inculcated in movies and interviews, and the way that we describe Black women with adjectives like aggressive more often than white women. And so people were inferring by just hearing a voice of an African-American woman that somehow she was angry when she wasn't. But they didn't do that for the same white woman's voice in those same kinds of tones. So it's very dangerous to infer someone's ideas, someone's thought process, someone's emotion from the way that you think they speak. And one of the solutions that we found when we do research on what makes people less likely to infer problematic things, is the more diversity you have in your life, the more varied foreign, sounding accents, the more varied types of dialects you surround yourself with, the varied type of people that you surround yourself with, the less judgmental you tend to be on these types of studies where you assign traits, because we tend to think in stereotypes, which is a very natural thing because they're cognitive shortcuts. But stereotypes often lead us astray because of our belief systems, right? Our ideologies about how people act and believe. But when we have information that's incongruent with those stereotypes, and we get more and more of that kind of information that basically says that stereotype is erroneous, then we have to actually get to know someone and make larger leaps in cognitive processing when we meet people to understand where they're coming from, because we're not just relying on these cognitive shortcuts. So I think the big answer is surround yourself with diversity. Be open to talking to people that you might have thought were too hard to talk to before, and you might be surprised at how that changes your perspective.
I love that. That's perfect. Thank you so much for that. And I completely agree. I think when you open yourself up to new ideas, new cultures, new surroundings, new experiences, it just gives you more of a worldly view, and you won't have those stereotypes or mindset in your head. And like, for example, for where I'm at work is like, people will reach out to me like, hey, Randy, can you help me with this really quickly? I was like, why are you coming to me? They're like, oh, I didn't think that a person would want to help me. I was like, why? That person's so nice. They're like, yeah, but sometimes I hear them speak and they don't come off nice. I'm like, that is the nicest person you've ever speak to. Like, so they have this stereotype that they just think based off of hearing someone potentially with an accent or where they're from or different language that like they're not approachable, when it's completely opposite.
Right. Well, think of our stereotype about Southerners, right? I grew up in the South, and I can tell you that I had a little more of a Southern accent when I left the South when I was 18. People would often infer things about me because of my subtle Southern accent. And normally they were on the lines of sort of, she's very, very friendly. She's very, very sweet. And I mean, I'm friendly and sweet, but I'm not that friendly and sweet. So, that's, again, we have these associations because of how they've been depicted in movies and the way that we talk about Southern women in particular as being very friendly, hospitable, kind. And that doesn't mean they're not, but that doesn't mean they're actually more of that than someone who speaks with a Northern accent, which we think of as sharp and aggressive and those kinds of things. So we have to just kind of learn to look past what we've learned to associate with those accents and dialects to get to know the person. And that doesn't mean that person isn't an asshole. They may very well be an asshole, but you should actually get to know that for sure before you just judge them from the way they're speaking.
Don't judge a book by its cover, or don't judge a book by the audio voice.
I guarantee you'll find some that are probably true to life, but the majority you'll find you should give a second chance.
Valerie, thank you so much for your time today. You've been amazing. You have dropped so much knowledge on us around linguistics and how we can work together and overcome some of the stereotypes we may feel in the way that we say words, the words you hear in voices. If people want to look you up, find anything that you've written, anything like that, how can people find you?
Well, they can just find me on my website, which is valeriefridland.com. Right. So just like my name will be spelled, valeriefridland.com. I also am writing a book for Viking Penguin that will be coming out next spring. And it's going to probably be called I Hate When You Say That. And it's all about these ideas we have about the way people talk, but it's written for, to have fun, for a general audience, to learn a little bit about linguistics, but from the perspective of how we live it in our lives. So how it applies to the things that we encounter in our daily lives. So, when we have teenagers, when we go to work, the way that we think of women's talk being different than men's talk, all of those things that we talk about when we talk about language, that's what that book will address. So hopefully some people will pick that one up too.
Awesome. And all the information will be in the bio of how you're listening or watching. This is Leap of Faith Podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Valerie. Please like and subscribe on all channels, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, everything. So Valerie, I would like you to do the sign off with me today. So please repeat after me. Stay healthy.
Stay healthy.
Stay wealthy.
Stay wealthy.
And have a good week, fans.
And have a great week, fans.
Deuces.